Thank you, Neil. Well, good evening and welcome from me, and thank you for coming, turning out on a dark night like this. Right, I have to say I found planning this seminar somewhat of a challenge, because I knew that half of the people in the room would know at least as much as me about the topic, and others may have relatively little knowledge. So I've tried to pitch the presentation so that it doesn't require too much prior knowledge of ITT, and I'm hoping that you will all find something to take away with you. So, also, it being a Sarah Fielden seminar, it seemed appropriate to start back at the beginning of teacher education in Manchester, a bit ambitious in less than an hour, but the first 100 years will be at a sprint before slowing down to consider the significant events of the 80s and 90s in terms of the tightening political control of ITT, and then I'll unpick in much more detail the key policy drivers of the coalition with Conservative years before reviewing where we are now in terms of ITT policy and perhaps policy makers. Important to say that this presentation draws on policy and research evidence in the reform of primary initial teacher education in England, a soon-to-be-released publication by the Cambridge Primary, or for the Cambridge Primary Review. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Rebecca. I'm Rebecca here, and in her absence, Jean Murray from the University of East London. So with no more ado then, I will go on back. I thought I would start at the end of the 19th century, when Sarah Fielden and her husband Sam were patrons of the Owens College, from which the Victorian Manchester University grew, of course. The day training colleges they opened in '89 for men and 2 years later for women were thought to be the first academic setting in England where teacher training was undertaken. 10 years later, Sarah, her husband Sam had died by then, endowed the first chair of education at Manchester, to which Harry Livingston Withers was appointed. And as many of you know, of course, we still have a Sarah Fielden chair in current incumbent Helen Gunter, and also we still award the Withers Prize to all trainees at the end of the year that achieve outstanding in every element of their training. So we'll briefly delve into the university archives to look at the lives of the trainee teachers in those early days, and astoundingly it doesn't actually look that different. So we learn that they studied standard academic subjects alongside professional subjects, that staff were keen they should have a significant amount of classroom teaching, that Manchester opened its elementary schools to the students, but that it was thought the best experience was gained at the demonstration schools, which were special schools administered by the colleges, and they were designed for the trainee teachers to allow them to engage critically with theories that they'd learnt in the lecture rooms through practical experience of teaching children. Owens College, actually fearful of the administrative and financial burdens of running such a school, were here initially proved resistant to the idea. And I have to say, 100 years later, when the teacher training agency came up with the bright idea to invite selected providers to run university training schools, an idea, of course, they say came from Finland. They had exactly the same response from the University of Manchester, albeit for slightly different reasons. Since we've got back this far, I thought it worthwhile just to go back another 50 years to the very beginnings of teacher education in the 1850s. And here again we see contemporary synergies with the present day. So we've got the school-led and school-based training through the National Pupil Teacher Scheme, and on the other hand we've got the emergence of the colleges of education. 1870 was the Elementary Education Act, when compulsory schooling was introduced up to the age of 13, but it actually wasn't fully implemented till the turn of the century. Back to the 1980s and the day training colleges, and here you see the beginning of the bifurcation between the colleges of education that actually trained the elementary school teachers and the universities, or what became university departments of education that went for the secondary elite sectors, so the grammar schools and the independent sector. So the next major change was the post-war baby boom, which caused a huge expansion for the now kind of primary sectors, so a big expansion in the training college sector, although actually it wasn't till 72 when compulsory training came in for for primary teachers, and it was 1980 before it became an all-graduate profession. The 80s and the 70s actually were also a time of great upheaval for ITT, because predictably after the boom in babies came a dramatic fall in the birth rate, and that triggered an equally big contraction in the training school sector, and it led to a raft of institutional mergers of training colleges with, as they were at the time, polytechnics. It was about economic viability, but it was also because they believed that they would be safer from government interference in those bigger autonomous institutions. I mean, misguidedly, as we now know, it turned out, but that was the rationale. And once part of academia, of course, they then struggled to establish their credibility within an academy that was somewhat contemptuous of education and didn't consider it to be a proper discipline. So ill-advisedly at the time, as it now turns out again, they fell back on the ologies, the foundation disciplines, philosophy, psychology, sociology, to assert their academic status. And so the scene was then set for the discourse of relevance to take hold with the politicians of the time, who demanded a return to the practical in teacher education. And in this, 1984 was a watershed year when the Council for Accreditation of Teachers was established, and they introduced competencies, they introduced minimum school days of training, which rose to actually 90 in 1993, and actually they stayed there then for the next 20 years. And in the early 90s they also established school-centred providers, SCITs, and school-centred training routes, although it would be another decade before rebadged as the graduate teacher programme they actually gained any traction in the sector, and then it was not really in the primary sector at all. And in fact it's not really been until the last 3 years that the SCITs have flourished. Something that did have immediate impact in the mid-90s was the establishment of Ofsted and the TTA, the Teacher Training Agency, which took over from Kate, and it brought a change of governance to the sector and a profound ideological shift, it felt at the time, from training, from education to training. Work started immediately on a national curriculum for ITT, which tightened partnership requirements and introduced standards of actually unimaginable detail. I think there were about 100 primary standards, if anyone else remembers that far back. Alan probably does. With a very demanding level of subject knowledge, as well in 3 core subjects plus ICT, and students were required to take a specialist subject as well, which was at an even higher level expectation. The next version of which were just standards in 2002 rather than a whole curriculum. It was vastly slimmed down, which was good, and the requirement for a specialist subject was abandoned, which in retrospect actually probably was not that good. For the next few years, the TTA and the sector was preoccupied with a teacher supply crisis, which culminated in a 50% increase in training numbers, which brought its own challenges in terms of ITT partnership. Training schools were established, and the National Partnership project was launched in order to address quality and capacity issues in school-based training in the regions. And one of the casualties of the supply crisis was the undergraduate sector, because it wasn't a tap that could be turned on and off, of course, quickly, and it shrank considerably in size, and also the length of the courses. Many changed from 4 years to 3 years, but that was triggered in fact by the introduction of postgraduate bursaries, and that was as a delayed response to the imposition 4 years earlier of higher education fees, just as the teacher supply crisis was kicking off. 2005, the TDA, as it now became, took on an entirely new remit, school development and the big workforce remodelling agenda, which was good because the heat was taken off ITT, but it was noticeable, I think, at the time that from there higher education became much more marginalised in terms of being seen by government as a partner in driving up school standards. That's where I think we started to lose the momentum. So in summary, what was the legacy of New Labour? So certainly ITT partnership was a great success overall and was internationally recognised as such. Labour had embedded it as a core principle and nurtured a healthy infrastructure supporting networks of providers and schools, and as a result, directly I think the quality and preparedness of trainees did improve, and they were judged by Ofsted to be better than ever. Although I would argue again that there was actually a lost opportunity at this point to raise the awareness of the contribution that ITT could make and research and inquiry processes could make to school improvement. Primary provision was refocused, so it mirrored what was going on in schools on the core curriculum, particularly literacy and numeracy, and there were a myriad of co-curricular initiatives and interventions that Labour had introduced. So the curriculum was vastly overcrowded, and it squeezed out non-core subjects and a lot of previously valued professional aspects of learning. The level of monitoring and accountability and inspection, both from the TDA and from Ofsted, was unimaginable. And it engendered a culture of compliance, which I think still remains to this day, and which led to a kind of technical, rational approach to educational outcomes, and I think it undoubtedly restricted the level of professional engagement of staff and students. A disarticulation was introduced in 1998 between the professional QTS award and the academic award, the PGC, of which I will say more later. And there was generally a loss of capacity in higher education because of a difficulty in attracting new recruits, because the salaries in HE were not commensurate with the school sector, which had improved considerably, and also I think staff no longer saw it as a panacea to go into to teacher education, and we're anxious about learning new research skills and knowledge that might be expected of them. On the management front, even then, the policy agenda was uncertain, and it led to short-term planning and associated effects like casualisation of staffing. Alongside this, in the higher education sector as a whole, there was an increase in, of course, selectivity in the research assessment exercise, and that led to a schism developing between research active staff on one side and teacher educators on another side, and that was both within institutions and in the sector of a whole. And it led to the situation where, put 80% there, it's probably more like by the 2010, 90% of teachers were trained in institutions without any core research funding, which is actually a problem when HE are arguing that their research knowledge and skills is their unique selling point and contribution to higher education. To initial teacher education, rather. Right, okay, so no lecture would be complete without it. And interestingly here, we are winding back to January 2010, 4 months before the fall of New Labour, when Dennis Sewell in The Spectator attached to this wonderful cartoon an article which went, the destruction of our school system has been a slow, drawn-out process. There is fortunately one last chance to save it. Of all the dramatic political battles that will begin only once the general election has been safely won, the most thrilling and the one that deserves top bill during David Cameron's first 100 days will be the cage fight between Michael Gove and the Blob. At stake will be our children's and grandchildren's futures and the Conservative Party's credibility as an agent of genuine social transformation. Although the Conservatives seem to have the will to take on the Blob, they must be very careful not to underestimate the monster's resilience. The Blob, for those of you that don't know, is an alien jelly-like amoeba that terrorised a small town in America, I think dissolving its inhabitants with a 57 film. I actually don't know how it worked out for the Blob in the end, but it was pitted against Steve McQueen, so my guess is it wasn't good. Anyway, in Sewell's analysis, the Blob, for which Reed the Academy has indoctrinated the new Labour government and hoodwinked them into developing pink and fluffy progressive fads such as Every Child Matters, safeguarding diversity, equality and personalised learning. So, flash forward 10 months, election over, coalition in power, first white paper, hot off the press, and we find what really matters is how we're doing compared to our international competitors. So every child does matter, but not in and of itself, rather as an economic unit of output, and we're told that's because that will define our growth and our country's future. Now, putting aside the fact that many of us would argue there is no simple linear relationship between education and economic growth, the narrative goes on to argue that falling down the league tables, the only way to reverse it is to learn lessons from successful school systems elsewhere. And read boldly through the text of this white paper and quoted explicitly at least 10 times is the very influential internationally influential McKinsey report, or how the world's best performing school systems come out on top. It was based on observations of 10 high-performing school systems and 7 with rapid improvement trajectory, of which 1 actually was the UK, which, given the rhetoric, I do wonder if Campbell and Clay actually knew that. Whatever, it's a simple recipe with just 3 ingredients, so it's just the kind that governments like. So that's getting the right people, for which we read high achieving individuals, training them to become effective instructors, and ensuring the system is able to deliver. Importantly, these three things are guaranteed to work irrespective of time and place, and have enormous impact. Context, no object. It doesn't really matter that 77% of between school differences in student performance in the UK is explained by a difference in socio-economic background, which is 22% higher than the average in the OECD. Back then to the Schools White Paper, in which you'll remember McKinsey is writ large. It also broadly contains three strands, but we'll focus just on the first two. The first strand, increase autonomy by accelerating academisation, is to ensure, of course, that the system is able to deliver the best possible outcomes, and that, of course, is by freeing it from the blob, in this case the arch enemies of promise, the local authorities. The second strand has got two elements. The first is to get the right people to become teachers, and that's achieved by attracting applicants with the highest academic qualifications. And the second is to develop them into effective instructors, and that the plan is to get them out of universities into school-led training, of course. When the next white paper was published by Nicky Morgan in 2016, actually it continued and indeed accelerated just the same themes, and actually many of the measures of the 2016 white paper, as you will know, have now been abandoned, so I won't dwell on it other than just to flash forward to 2016 to see how the accelerated academisation programme panned out. The programme, you might know, had stalled somewhat prior to 2016, mainly due to the recalcitrance of the primary sector, where only a fifth of schools had converted compared to the secondary, where 2/3 had converted. So Nicky Morgan shifted the accelerated programme up a gear to a forced programme, declaring that all schools would become academies and join MATs by 2020, and that by 2022 we would no longer need local authorities involved in running our schools. Despite a year earlier that the Education Committee concluding that there's at present no convincing evidence of the impact of academy status on attainment in primary schools, and the day before the Chief Inspector had published the most damning report on the indictment of 7 MATs that had been inspected. They were actually inspected for the first time, that MATs had been allowed to be inspected by the government. Now, opposition from Morgan's own backbenchers caused the plan to begin to unravel, and in degrees over the next 6 months, and it was actually finally abandoned on the 27th of October by Morgan's successor Nicky Greening in a written ministerial statement on further education and technical skills, interestingly enough. However, quite some alarming patterns are beginning to emerge for the percentage of teachers without QTS in primary academies. So as you'll know, one of the privileges that academies and free schools are granted is that they are able to hire unqualified staff. And looking at the figures there, you can see that sponsor academies have double the amount of unqualified staff of maintained schools, and free schools have got over 4 times as many. With the caveat, of course, that these are very small numbers of schools, and in fact that some of those will be trainees on employment-based routes into training. However, it is clearly something to watch. And I don't know if any of you noticed in the Sunday Times this week. The head of the Michaela Community School in Brent, who employs 1/3 of her staff, are unqualified. It's the most apparently in any state school, and she accuses teacher education of promoting progressive liberal values. She says it's far easier to hire unqualified teachers. They don't have to unlearn bad habits, and they learn very quickly within weeks and even days. This is true. Would that it were that easy. Right, okay, so back then to the 2010 schools agenda and the ITT specific measures in it, as which of course there were a lot, were implemented the following year in yet another white paper training our next generation of teachers. I won't go through it in detail, just look at the policy synergies and dissonances, and we immediately pick up the attract brightest graduates with financial incentives, and later on increase the rigour of skills tests, expand Teach First into primary and early years. So again, on message there, in terms of bright graduates, launch Troops to Teachers. On the face of it, seems a little bit of a policy malfunction there, but we're told that it's because we know service leaders can make outstanding teachers, role models and mentors. Now, no research is cited on this occasion, and I'm not sure if I was an army recruiter if those would be my top 3 criteria, but let's just suspend disbelief and pass on. Make application easier through the single UCAS platform. If we have time, we'll have a look how that panned out. And launch School Direct. So for those of you that don't know, briefly, this involves schools bidding for training places and then commissioning accredited providers of ITT to help them train the individual. Now that could be a higher education provider, it could be a school-centred skit, it also could be a private provider, of which there are quite a number popping up now. So this next year, the following year, the School Direct salaried route was launched. Same principle pertains, except the salaried route are training on the job, so they are not supernumerary. So again, on message, develop them into effective teachers through a school-led route, and in this case it was to be spearheaded by the new teaching school network, of which number 1 on their remit was plan and lead high quality school-based training. Although in the event, in the first couple of years, they actually applied for less than half the places and were given less than half the places to teaching school alliances. The white paper, of course, caused some degree of consternation in the higher education sector, and concern was also apparent in the education committees, the Education Select Committee's responses to it. So firstly, they questioned the evidence that bursaries, which in secondary can be up to £30,000, of course, were good value for money, and whether they were attracting bright candidates that were also suitable for teaching. And in particular, they questioned the use of degree class as an indicator in the primary sector, and suggested that instead A-levels and the breadth of A-levels might be more relevant, again, not to mention suitability to teach. Secondly, they welcomed the government's, including universities, as strategic partners of teaching schools, but again cautioned very firmly against any diminution of the university's role in teacher training. However, the superficially positive messages from the white paper were completely undermined. I think it was the next week with an unnamed source in the Daily Telegraph reporting that for far too long left-wing colleges have imbued teachers with useless teaching theories that don't work and actively damage children's education. Ministers are planning to slash the number of students on university-based courses over the next 3 years by half, shifting to on-the-job training by 2015. A year later, and the blob returns. Same old diatribe. Enemies of promise, politically motivated individuals who've been actively trying to prevent millions of our poorest children getting the education they need. This time it was Gove that broke cover. The 1,000-word tirade was in the Mail on Sunday, and you may remember it was triggered by a letter from 100 academics a few days earlier in the Independent, which actually related to the new knowledge-based curriculum, and it was nothing to do with ITT at all. But again, note the similarity in rhetoric and content between this and the Spectator article and the Daily Telegraph unattributed source. So what happened? Did Gove get his 50%? Well, of course he did. By 2015, and sorry, it's gone off the screen there, isn't it? I can't point because I haven't got a pointer. So if you look at the far column, 2015-16, 49%, the bottom block is HEIs, and then as they rise up, it's skits, and then school direct unsalaried, school direct salaried, and lastly, the top block is Teach First. And that is, of course, 51%. It tips. So interestingly, 2015, despite its inception 12 years previously, was the first year that Teach First had ever been returned in this particular allocations model. And the cynics amongst us might think that that was perhaps more than a happy coincidence for Mr. Gove. Right, just a quick summary, delving down into the primary figures. Again, school-led, when we take out the undergraduate, is just over 50, well, a little bit over 50% of the postgraduate numbers in primary. But the training characteristics, I think, show some interesting patterns. The HE column is very different because, of course, half of those students are undergraduates who are predominantly young, white, British and female, which in itself I think has to be questioned and probably isn't as much as it should be. School direct salaried, as you might expect, is older and higher proportion of males. Overall, the proportion of males peaked at the time of the economic crisis, which is traditionally the case, and it's plateaued since then at about 18%. But the statistic that concerns me most in this is the ethnic minority trainees, which has been static now for 10 years, and it's at about 8%, and that's nationally, so there are wide regional variations in that, of course. Meanwhile, the non-white British population is continued to rise and is currently estimated to be about 17%, in England that is, and the non-white British primary school pupil population meanwhile has risen to over 30%, again with wide variations from 12% in the northeast to 82% in London, inner London. So not at all satisfactory in terms of diversity of the workforce, and I do wonder why the teaching agency isn't onto that. Okay, let's move back to the policy to establish the school-led training and increase the amount of time spent in schools practicing skills. And we're asking here is what was the evidence for that policy. So the claim is that where teachers have had extensive initial training in schools, they perform better, and that was made in training our next generation of teachers, and then it was repeated in 2016 white paper. There were two sources quoted, 2010 sources, one was Mentor and one was Musset et al. Neither of the bibliographic detail were included in the white papers, but one of the likely sources was Ian Mentor, who wrote a letter to the THES protesting that he hadn't actually published a single-authored publication in 2010, so it certainly wasn't him, and he certainly wouldn't agree with the claim anyway. I tracked down the other likely source, and a careful reading of that wouldn't support the claim either. However, if Gove had gone at the time to consult his own chief inspector in 2011, he would have had a very different take on things, because reviewing the work of all ITT providers for the last 3 years, they reported that there is more outstanding provision in primary and secondary partnerships led by higher education institutions than in school-centred partnerships or in employment-based routes. And in the very same document, Ofsted reported that current year, only 4% of primary and 3% of secondary teachers were deemed to be outstanding. Now, I'm pleased I'm not taking any position on the accuracy of these judgments. I'm simply exploring the evidence that was available at the time to inform the government policy. Anyway, by 2013, things had changed apparently so radically in the university sector that our independent inspection service felt the need to issue a special press release saying that none of the institutions, higher education institutions inspected so far, have been awarded outstanding. Every one of the providers to have received the highest grade was a small employment-based partnership with schools centrally involved. And some of these had recently achieved SCIT status from the teaching agency, which of course the teaching agency were trying to promote at the time, very successfully as it turns out, because in the 3 years from then to 2015, the number of SCITs, I think, nearly trebled. Right, so the evidence then, it seems, is not as robust as it might be, but let's just move on to see if nevertheless the training model was fit for purpose. So the question here then is, will more time in school over and above, remember, the 2/3 already spent in there, inevitably and unproblematically lead to better and more relevant professional learning? So let's look at the primary context to begin with. The role of the primary teacher, multifunctional, incredibly demanding in terms of academic engagement, and also in many schools on the welfare side of things. I mean, not surprisingly, this year primary heads reported that the top 3 reasons for teachers resigning, by a long margin, the top 2 were getting a job elsewhere and can't cope with the workload. So what are the learning context? Well, as we know, increasingly disparate, the curricular arrangements and assessment practices, national levels of assessment abandoned, academies, as long as they teach a broad and balanced curriculum, can teach what they want. School system, again, freed from local control and accountability, so again that's set to become increasingly fragmented. So let's look then at the training model. So Gove's thesis is that training is a craft and it's best learned as an apprentice, observing a master craftsman or woman, and it's the one that still underpins many school direct programs, particularly the school direct salaried programs, Again, just break off to say I'm talking generally here, not specifically about University of Manchester or their partners, and indeed some of the best school direct programmes are absolutely excellent, and have introduced some innovative ideas into training that was well overdue. So we see there then that the apprenticeship model is based on immersion, it's an induction into a community of knowledge and practice, and the main focus is about adopting locally relevant teacher knowledge, skills, behaviours, identities, attitudes, and in particular of that school or MAT setting, leading, as we'll see in a minute, possibly down the line to what Whitty calls branded professionalism. I would argue that rather than an apprenticeship model for the modern times, a model of training, a developmental model of training grounded in reflective and inquiry skills, so that teachers are more versatile in their skill set and knowledge base and pedagogic practices, so as to afford them mobility within the sector and also across place and over time. And in fact, back in 2003, Edwards and Prothero warned of exactly this dilemma, that the challenges facing a participatory version of teacher education are complex. Student teachers need to develop a generality of knowing which will enable them to interpret new teaching situations and see the pedagogic potential in them. So of course, having trained their own teachers, many multi-academy trusts might not actually want them to have mobility within the system, and we only have to look across the Atlantic for a portent of the branding of professionalism that could very, very easily emerge here. So, for example, the Relay Graduate School of Education is perhaps the market leader over there. It operates master's degree awarding programmes, multiple campuses, independently from universities and in collaboration with three particular charter management organisations, which are like our MATs, our multi-academy trains, and it prepares teachers and principals. It actually advertises on its website that this is in response to a nationwide failure by most university-based teacher-educator programmes to prepare teachers for the realities of the 21st century. Match is another education, Match Education is another brand, and in this case it was the Match charter schools that actually established their own grad school, in the US they even passed legislation that allows states to apply for grants to set up teacher preparation academies independent from universities and exempt from state requirements that other teacher preparation programs must meet. So we hear further from Kretschner and Zeitner that Relay presents itself in opposition to university teacher education, claiming that they are exceptional thinkers who are not sitting in ivory towers. They go on to say this uncritical glorification of practice and demonisation of educational theory is evident in the structure and content of the programmes, as well as the current reform literature, which characterises university education schools as emphasising theory at the expense of preparation in effective teaching practices. And we can only see that the relaxing of regulations regarding degree awarding powers in England, of course, makes it not an unlikely development on this side of the pond for large academy chains or private providers, as I say, which there are a number emerging. The largest probably is Hibernia College Dublin, which is an accredited online provider. And of course we already have our own strong brand name in Teach First, which might be another development. Okay, back to England after the 2011 white paper. Yet another review of teacher education was announced, this time led by Sir Andrew Carter. It reported in 2015, took a very long time. We haven't time, it's not relevant to go through all the recommendations, of which there were 18, but the first was that a framework for the core content of ITT should be developed, and that was published. That took a year, and it was published, or over a year. It was published a few months back. It was, in my opinion, underwhelming, which is probably a good thing, remembering the last one actually. But one positive shift that was augured by the Carter review was that it embedded evidence-based teaching, and also the model of a teacher as research literate technician was evident, and the notion of repositories of research was floated, although it did sound perhaps as though it was heading towards a US style what works clearinghouse rather than something that we might recognise. Just some more points that I did want to highlight from the Carter review, and the first is just the importance of ensuring trainees experience effective mentoring for no other reason than that. I think it's just so important. I put down R13 there simply to note the absence of higher education mentioned anywhere in those robust partnerships. R14 is the one that I actually wanted to focus on particularly, and that's about the way in which teachers qualify. So Carter says we would like applicants to understand that QTS is the essential component of ITT and that PGC is just an optional academic qualification. And actually, for those of you that don't know, PGC actually encompasses QTS as well. And you know, the associated narrative was wonderful. With clear exasperation, he observed that some graduates perceive PGCE course as having more status inexplicably and more likely to be academically rigorous and more important. And as a result, many schools feel compelled to work with universities, brackets, when they really don't want to. Anyway, the deep irony of the complex and confusing system to which the report speaks is that actually it does tell applicants that QTS is all they need to teach in England and Wales very clearly. But what it doesn't tell them is that actually QTS will not qualify them to teach anywhere else in the world, and that for that they will need a PGCE. I think we're not doing very well, but we'll just have a quick look anyway, just out of interest to this complex and confusing system. So this is the UCAS system. The new UCAS system went on last night. There seem to be more every week. 1,539 programmes to choose from, and you're able to sort that through filters of age range. Well, you've only got one age range, primary. It's a specialist primary, or you can go for specialists with some generalist or specialist. Programme types, you've got 4 programme types on that website, and then there are another 2 programme types, undergraduate, which is through another platform on UCAS, and then Teach First, which is a completely different admissions setup altogether. Programme variants, you can go from full-time or part-time, and then outcomes, you've got to choose whether you want QTS with professional, QTS with postgraduate, or QTS and equivalent. Don't ask me what equivalent is, I didn't know anything was equivalent to QTS, but there you go. The first 2 are actually both, you probably wouldn't recognise them, they are both academic awards, and that was brought on the sector in 2007 by QAA actually, when the sector started awarding master's credits for PGCE 60 master's credits, which of course is what a postgraduate certificate should be, but that brought into then sharp focus the anomaly that we've always called it a PGC when it wasn't. So the ones that weren't awarding 60 master's credits then started calling their courses professional certificate of education, which actually sounded more relevant really in many ways, but of course they were at level 6, so they were at good honours degree level. Okay, so of course I mean, it's not surprising that the consensus is that it isn't easy to navigate, and you know, kind of one report after another has condemned it for the volume and spread of information. Teaching careers confusing, contradictory, and overwhelming. Right, okay, we're winding up now. So, where are we now in terms of ITT policy? I would argue, to conclude, that policymakers' judgments are frequently based on ideological grounds and not evidence-based or even evidence-informed. And in drawing up policy, they often have secondary model in mind, and they also lack awareness, and indeed actually there's a general lack of research on phase-specific characteristics, which is a real problem. Schools have become the key location for learning and the legitimation of knowledge in ITT. The workplace immersion is the dominant model, and academic rigour is threatened. Trainees spend more time, even in school, in practice than prepare and reflect mode. So the danger is that they will be inducted early into localised practices and norms before they develop the criticality and the reflective skills to situate that in the wider context. An adaptive, as I've said, in my mind, an adaptive craft apprenticeship which privileges performativity and local practical knowledge is just not effective in this increasingly fragmented and disparate system where teachers need to be versatile. Disregard for policymakers' disregard, we should say, for the added value, not trainees, of academic qualifications that will equip trainees with practical skills and intellectual capabilities and qualified teacher status. It has implications. The privileging of QTS, or indeed obviously no training, has implications for the teaching profession, the teaching quality, the development of the world-class school system, the status of the profession, and, as we've said, the mobility of teachers. Partnership, that is of schools and HE, which was a key principle of ITT, is under threat, and the relationship is being redefined so as to marginalise higher education to just a transactional role of training provider. And I think the HE sector do have, and you know, and the caveat if stabilised to restore, as we're beginning to see. We've got through 3-year allocations now, so if more of the sector is stabilised to restore its medium-term planning capability, has an important role to play, supporting engagement with research and inquiry processes to aid trainee learning and to aid teacher professional learning, school development work, and actually to help sustain the educational infrastructure both locally and nationally. You know, a lot of the professional associations, a lot of the textbooks are written by teacher educators. I also think HEIs have a particular role in supporting the small primary schools who really do rely on collaborative structures for access to effective support. and to ensure that really, really important consistency and quality of training, and to kind of extend mentors' knowledge and understanding both of high quality learning, what makes a high quality learning environment for adult learners, and effective andragogical skills, so they can in turn support high quality training and development progress. Right. Thank you for listening.